Lounge by the Afro-Caribbean Book Club.
She's got a sense of humour.
We're all married to the same man. I thought that is enough to,
to get you going.
I'm your host, Jacqueline.
And also she knew her daughter would have the worst time because, lightness was all that mattered in Malaj. So
every month we select a book written by an author of Afro-Caribbean descent. We read it.
And even now, many years later, everyone remembers the shock of Sweaty Lou pushing through the glass doors, chest heaving, neckline darkened.
And get together to discuss and debate over it.
And they're called coloured, so you're not black.
No. Coloured people are mixed race people.
Once in a while, we even invite the author along to come and talk to us about their writing.
We see him as a very diplomatic, Machiavellian leader. We see all his powerful side. We don't tend to see very much of what his mistress is or...
You're welcome to read along with us and join in the discussion. Thank you so much for joining us for the first ever episode of Book and Lounge. I'm joined by Katrina, Annette and Taiwo, and we're going to be talking about my favourite book from last year, Things That Are Withheld by Kei Miller. The book is a very personal and intimate collection of essays by the poet and novelist, and in it he examines silence and the things we leave unsaid, his body and how it's perceived by others, and a whole load more. Let's hear what everybody thought about the book. I guess I'll start with you, Katrina and Taiwo. Why did you enjoy the book? And secondly, what your favourite essays were and why?
I think I like the book because, I know I like the book because the way he has his words. I mean, being a poet, Kei Miller, I think he's very lyrical. I mean, at the time I was saying poetic, but I stand corrected. It's lyrical. The way in which he's able to connect the essays so that they kind of progressively flow, as it were, but more so the way he captures dialogue and the way in which people talk. Even more than that, I think it's just the way he expresses himself. Some of the expressions are, they're quite poetic or lyrical, for want of a better word. So I like his fiction, and I thought I probably would like the non-fiction as well. He has a way of untangling complicated issues, but in a way that's quite accessible, because I think it's almost as if to say he's not writing to the reader. He's as if he's making a post-it note. He's writing on a post-it note to himself in order to untangle the knots of maybe a complicated issue that he's trying to understand better. That's what I liked about it.
Right, I liked it a lot more than I was expecting to like it. I ended up liking it, whereas I thought I was going to be sort of wading through it. But it didn't turn out to be like that at all. But the first one, where he's explaining, considering the silence, why we withhold things and what's going on in the, the things that we don't speak about. I thought that was very interesting. It makes you very thoughtful. Then I liked the one that the old black woman who sat in the corner, which is more of a story than an essay, but maybe that's why I liked it. I don't know. Yeah, the Mr. Brown, Mrs. White and Ms. Black. I think it's interesting because all these race things, they do depend a bit on where you are at the time. And it's just interesting to see him play it backwards and forwards. I think I liked a lot of it. I thought the one, when he was in Africa, I felt in more familiar territory, really, because I've never been to the Caribbean at all. So when he was talking about Kenya and Ghana, I felt a bit more, I could relate to what he was seeing. When he was talking about all the carnival things, it was interesting and it was fun, but it's very outside what I have ever experienced. So it was interesting in a different way, but not the way where you can say that that you can relate to it directly yourself. Anyway, so yes, I enjoyed lots of it.
So I was just flicking through the contents, and I realised I liked The Crimes That Haunt the Body. I liked Mr. Brown, Mrs. White, and Ms. Black. I liked the old woman, the old black woman who sat in the corner, and I also liked the white women and the language of bees.
Uh-huh.
I also liked the boys at the harbour. So I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there's just so many of them that I actually really enjoyed reading, and it gave me insights that I hadn't actually considered previously.
While Tara was talking, I was flicking through the list of contents, and it's the same. You keep finding another one that you think, oh yes, and I like that bit about such and such. So it's a successful
Mm-hmm.
assembly of essays, I suppose.
Yeah, I think I agree with both of you. I think it was a really well put together collection. But something that you said, Taiwo, you thought it was like a post-it note that he was writing himself. I actually felt as if I was reading diary entries or journal entries as I was reading them, because they're very personal and they're very, it's him having a dialogue with himself as well as the reader. He's actually examining why he does certain things and how he sees things. So that's why I felt as if I was actually, eavesdropping on him writing his diary.
Because in some ways, it's almost as to say he exposes himself.
Exactly. Yes, they're very personal.
He talks about his inner thoughts, his
Uh-huh.
inner life. He admits that where his frailties show, his vulnerability, his humanness. He
Exactly.
knows that some of his thoughts or some of his approaches to certain issues are wrong, but he doesn't disown them. He says, I know I shouldn't, but this is what I thought, even though maybe I didn't say it.
Exactly. And which is why I find them, because most of the time we think those things about ourselves, but we don't speak it out. And we will write it down and we will think about it and we'll have it in our minds and in our heads, but we actually do not speak it out to other people, which is
The problem
why.
is most of the time we won't even write it down, because even to write it down it's too dangerous to commit it to the internet.
Unless you're going to put it in a diary, which you're then going to put away.
Yes, and hope that no one gets your diary.
Exactly. Well, which is, I keep a diary, and I do worry because at some point
Is
when
it
I
in English
die.
or is it in some kind of code?
Sorry.
Is it in some kind of code or
No,
is it in English?
no, it's free flowing language. So I keep thinking to myself, one of these days I'm going to die, right? And then whoever inherits my stuff is going to pick them up, and then he's going to start reading them. And I'm thinking, I wonder what they will think.
I think this is the real Jackie J.
Well, anyway, I won't be here. So anyway, so going back to the book, I'm going to start off with a quote. It is the body that I wish to write about, these soft houses in which we live and in which we move and from which we can never migrate except by dying. I want to write about our bodies and what they mean and how those meanings shift even as our bodies move throughout the world, throughout time and throughout space. So that's when he's basically setting the scene about what he wants to explore in these essays. What kind of bodies does he write about, and what does he have to say about the body?
No, I'm just thinking because there are quite a few different essays and they touch on different types of bodies.
Well,
So he's
yeah.
not
So I mean,
just writing on,
what kind of bodies does he touch on?
yeah, but he's not just writing about black bodies. He's a black author and
Hmm.
he's writing about black bodies. He does. He's a gay author and he writes about gay bodies. He does. But he
Hmm.
writes about much more than that.
Which is like what? What is the much more?
For example, it may be the crimes that haunt the body. It may be within that essay, but the portion where he was talking about um, being asked to disrobe when he was, I think it was in Turkey.
Iran?
Was it Iran?
I think it was either Iran or Iraq. It was one of those. Yeah, yeah.
So that where he was talking about being naked in front of these three customs officials who, it seems, were not really checking for drugs. They just wanted to exercise or misexercise power over
Uh-huh.
him because they could. And then the other instance where he was talking about being a 6 foot dread. He's talking about his weight at that stage. His weight was whatever his weight was, which
Hmm.
gave me an indication of the fact that over the years he's had this issue with his body. So the body in which he himself is, he's had issues with his weight,
Yeah.
and therefore his size. So he talks about the body in all kinds of dimensions, the body in which changes over time, but also the body that he's writing about, as in his own body, the relationship that he's had with his body and how that has changed according to how he views his body and how he thinks his body is perceived by people outside of his own body.
Katrina, do you have anything to add to that?
When I was first reading it, and I didn't, okay, he keeps mentioning the body, but I wasn't really taking the body itself on board properly, I think. I mean, he was talking about a lot of issues, and I was very interested in the issues, but I didn't spend time to relate it to the body as such. But when I'm thinking about it more, I think, to me, the book was a lot about the assumptions people make. And of course, the assumptions are based on the exterior that you see of people. And I found it very interesting, these ones where a lot of people don't seem to perceive him as gay when they meet him. That he doesn't come across as a gay man, he comes across as a big black man, apparently. And he gives these examples, like the gay couple he was sitting opposite to in the airport, who I don't think he said what colour they were, but I sort of thought perhaps they were white.
Yeah.
And they think he's looking at them because he disapproves, and he's looking at them because he thinks they look cute together. And then they reveal a different side of themselves, really. You know, and the woman who goes into the coffee shop and starts sort of accusing him of being a homophobic Jamaican. Yeah, so I see how it ties together, but mostly for me it's just issues that about how you perceive the world.
Yeah, so I sort of agree with you there, and I was wondering whether or not really it is bodies that, or whether or not it's really the color that determines how people react and the violence or the distaste that they have towards the bodies that he's describing, rather than actually what the body looks like. If the guy if he was a white guy that was playing that music in that student union shop, would the white woman have had the same reaction? If he was a white guy who was sitting on the train looking at the gay couple, would they have had the same reaction? So I do wonder whether or not actually it's the body that makes people react the way that they do towards him, or whether or not actually it's his color. I mean, do they react the same way to white men or Asian men who are 6 foot with long hair?
But in the coffee shop, though, I mean, it does kind of, things fall into place, as in he had dreads at that time. He's over 6 feet tall, and at that stage he was pretty heavy, and so it's quite easy for the person to assume that, and I assume also that the lady didn't really understand what was being said in the lyrics, so she assumes that the lyrics are homophobic, and therefore she equates 1 and 1 as 3. I mean, it's just like at the beginning when he's talking about sitting on the steps near his flat. Well, he's writing about his own vulnerabilities, even though he's a man. And the stereotype is, well, if you're in an abusive relationship, a man should be able to either dish out the abuse or deal with the abuse, maybe to just walk away, walk out of the relationship. But he wasn't in that frame of mind, or he didn't feel able to. He seemed to want to walk on eggshells in order to not provoking, quote, his partner.
But in terms of body, how does that relate to the bodies and the violence against the bodies?
Well, I think it relates in terms of he's over 6 feet tall, of a certain weight. You would expect him to be able to look after himself, carry himself, as it were. But here he is in a relationship where he is being, well, I guess virtually submissive.
That essay for me is more about silence and the things we don't talk about. Because the title of the book is Things That Are Withheld. In that essay, rather than saying things and saying how he feels about the situation, he chooses to stay quiet. To have some kind of peace, he chooses to stay quiet. Silence is another theme that features really heavily in the book. And he chooses to write about situations where things have happened and perhaps he should have said something, but he chooses to remain silent. And I think at some point he says that, and he says that always the most important things are the things that we cannot say. Have you been in a situation where perhaps you should have said something and decided not to say something? And why did you decide to stay quiet?
I just have a question. So all the kind of situations that you brought up, him being stopped in Iran or Iraq, and then with the gay couple and everything like that, I'm assuming did he not stand up for himself in any of those situations?
No. And he's writing about situations where things have happened to him, and he should have said something or could have said something, but he's chosen to remain silent.
However, he doesn't really, you know, if you think about the white woman and the bees, he decides to speak out, doesn't he, in through the essay,
Yes.
to make his point through the essay. And a lot of those things are things that he said about, he's kind of criticizing a white woman who's written about Jamaica, but not done it very authentically in his mind, in his view. Yeah, I mean, that's the sort of thing that often we do withhold, isn't it? We listen to somebody going on about something, and then we decide not to actually make the criticism, whatever it might be. But in that situation, although he does it through writing, he is still speaking out, isn't he?
Well, he is, but also in those essays, these women have written something, and then someone has said something to them, someone has criticized them for writing what they've written, and then they've taken offense or they felt really hurt by the things that people who have written or commented on their books and their articles have said. So although he understands why people will have taken offense at what they've written, this is all about, I guess, censorship and cultural appropriation, which is, I guess, something that we can come on to later. But going back to the things that we don't say, if these women had written these essays and nobody had commented, what would you think would have been the benefit of that?
The women would remain in ignorance of how people really feel.
No benefit at all. I mean, I think my personal view is that they can write the essay if they want to. Anyone can write the essay they want to write. But then if someone else criticizes it, they also have that right. But I think often people, maybe in more, not in such a big situation as that, critiquing somebody's published work, but people are afraid of someone being upset, aren't they? Often handling someone being upset is more stressful than just keeping quiet.
Because for one of those women writers, when I think she was like being interviewed by someone, she gave that throwaway comment of, it doesn't really matter, or something like that. It's only in the Caribbean, it's one of these Jamaican or one of these islands, so it doesn't really matter. And there was this kind of almost pregnant pause where people were thinking, did she actually say that? That it doesn't matter here, as in here anything goes. What
do you think, if like a black British person who happened to be over there making a speech, if they'd made a similar sort of faux pas, would it have the same impact?
Well, it would not be as harsh, but they'll still be criticized. And the reason why I say that is because when I go home and I say certain things, I'm always criticized, and I'm always told, you're looking at this from your diasporan view.
But you would be forgiven quicker.
Probably.
Yes, and I think that's where the body comes in, isn't it? That more judgments are made on account of blackness or whiteness.
Yes.
In the situation.
And also about residents, I think, as well. In addition, because if you're not resident, if you're non-resident, then you can possibly be more easily forgiven than someone who is resident. So if you're resident, like the white woman, and you've been resident there for like 2 decades, and you have chosen to use your voice to speak about this particular place because you believe that you have some kind of insight into this particular place, putting to one side the fact that the way in which she spoke on behalf of this character that she had created was inauthentic, which is where the whole thing came in. But putting that to one side, the fact that she's using her voice as a white woman to comment on this particular place because she's been living in this place for 2 decades, it's harder to forgive such a person because the person is saying, I have certain experience of this place because this is where I live, this is where I choose to call home, this is the place I choose to call home, as opposed to someone that is just maybe visiting, even if they are black. They're saying, no, I'm a foreigner. I may be black like you, but I don't know the nuances necessarily. I don't know the ins and outs of this particular society because I don't live here.
Coming back to this whole issue of writing about where you live or not being allowed to write about certain places because, well, I don't know if not being allowed to is the right word, but being criticized for writing about certain places or certain characters. I'm just wondering where we draw the line when it comes to this issue of cultural appropriation. Should we allow people to write what they believe is what is authentic to them and what for them is right? Or should we, like in this instance, actually call them out when we don't believe that the character is authentic? Where does it stop and where do we draw the line?
No, I think in terms of writing, it's just literary criticism, isn't it? If it's not authentic and that's how it strikes somebody who has a deeper knowledge or of that place, they should speak. I don't see any problem about that at all. I think the problem comes when people are making money out of it. You know, this is just my personal feeling. You know, if people want to do their hair in a certain way, it's no point in saying, oh, you shouldn't be wearing braids, it looks ridiculous, and you're a white person. It doesn't matter. But if they're making a lot of money out of it in some way, then I think that's where issues come in, really. You know, like, well, you know the sort of thing
I think I kind of understand where we're going with that. And then I feel that you can convincingly write about being British and be authentic about it.
As authentic as I can be, I suppose. It's all based on my. Yeah, I think so. Like, if I read books set in other places, I may know that the author might not be that familiar, but I might know it well. I do kind of judge it from another kind of eye as well, just to see how right they've got it. But it's terrible to say, I do probably feel that there's just a bit more authenticity in being able to write about where if you have a familiarity of the area, whether that's because you're born there, you've been raised there, or you've lived there for a substantial amount of time. Not to say you can't write about anywhere else, but I don't know how real it could be, I suppose.
I mean, you guys, you've all been living here, I don't know for how many donkey's years. Why shouldn't you write about it? Like, if I chose to write about living in Scotland, I've never lived in Scotland. It's not going to come out correctly. Maybe if I did loads and loads of research and a few trips, it might be okay. But I don't know. It might not be okay. But if you're writing about what you know, it's going to come out. No, who can criticize you for writing about what your experience is? It won't be wrong.
But that's the issue, though, isn't it? Quality control is the issue because if you know, then that's fine because it will come across, that knowledge will come across. If you know the voice that a person that lives in that particular area would use, the mannerisms, the expressions, and so on and so forth, it will come out in that quality control. But if you're putting words in the mouth of a man that would not say things in that way, the way in which you would say things, then you lose the quality control. But the other issue as well is that thing about cultural appropriation is where people take from other cultures, which is quite normal, but they don't seem to give credit. That's where the issue tends to lie. Because if I were to, I don't know, wear a kimono, Japanese kimono or something, as long as you could give credit, or if you were to have your own version, a Ugandan version of a Japanese kimono, and then you gave credit and said, this is my version, rather than simply, you know, that kind of thing where the mass media went crazy when who was it? Was it Brooke Shields back in the day when she had cornrows or something? As if to say, people hadn't seen people with cornrows until Brooke Shields rocked cornrows, and it's just that thing where you just accept it. You won't say this is where this thing came from, or this is my interpretation of cornrows. But do you know that for millennia, black women have been rocking cornrows, even though you've not commented upon it? It's the ownership.
Yes, it's around that, isn't it? But the problem with the book, I mean, on the one hand, you think, well, like freedom of speech, people can write what they want to write. But if the book is inauthentic and it's making a lot of money, even if people are criticizing it, somebody's getting away in a sense with misrepresenting. But all you can do really is criticize it and counter it with those issues. You wouldn't want to go down the road of stopping people writing things, would you?
Let's say we have a reader who picks up the book. The impression, I guess, that they're going to get of that place is what they've read in the book. They read widely, but they read from different places. They're not necessarily going to do the research and actually determine whether or not what they're reading is authentic, are they?
But authentic for who?
For the place in which the person is writing about.
But how are you going to control that?
But the thing is that many people live in London, but people's experiences of London can be very different. I mean, if you're living in East London, geographically, it can be very different from if you live and you only stay around Kensington and maybe Hyde Park, kind of upmarket areas. If that's all you really know of London, as opposed to someone
Our current government then.
Pardon?
Our current government then.
But Jackie, going back to your point, supposing the person who only reads their book once in 3 years, they pick up these essays and they read The White Woman and the Bees. Are they going to then perhaps think that white women are all going to start whinging and crying if they get criticised?
But wouldn't they say that that's the author's opinion?
Well, it obviously might be.
Right, moving on. Mr. Brown, Mrs. White, and Miss Black. If I can find my piece of paper, that's an essay that where color and class converge. Sorry, Taiwo, do you mind just telling us a little bit about the three characters?
I think Mr. Brown was my favourite character amongst the three of them because he was a highly educated. I think he had started doing a PhD, or no, he had thought about.
No, he did start doing. He did everything but the dissertation.
Okay, so he didn't actually complete it and get it, but he was able to be quite introspective and see things more clearly and in a more critical way, to the extent that he could criticize himself and people, his peers, his contemporaries. He could criticize them. With Mrs. White, I think she and the relationship between her and her housemaid or helper or whatever you want to call housekeeper, let's just say, I found that very interesting in that they both had very different views, different perspectives of the same issue, as in, is life hard for the white woman or is life hard for the black woman? And life was hard for both women, but for different reasons. And then for Miss Black, I guess it was about moving from one class to another in order to progress, and whether she was comfortable in this other class or alienated, and not alienated, isolated.
Mr. Brown says that brownness is a racial category. Do you think that brownness is a race based on what his definition of ethnicity and race?
I think in the Jamaican context, it is.
Why? How?
Because I likened it to apartheid South Africa, where coloured people are, maybe from the Indian subcontinent, and they're called coloured. So you're not black.
No. Coloured people are mixed race people.
Are they?
Yeah. Indian people are Indian people. No matter how many years you've been living there.
Okay, I got that wrong then.
But they do refer to, because it was the same in Zimbabwe in the old days, and even now people still use the same words. The coloured people then intermarried amongst themselves. So in a way, they did almost make a group.
So you're saying coloured people are dual heritage then, mixed?
I don't really agree with the proposition that I don't agree with most of the race stuff, really. So I don't see how brown people can be anything particular. I mean, I don't get it. But in terms of what they meant in Zimbabwe, for example, the forefathers who intermarried produced mixed race children. But those mixed race children were then encouraged to mainly marry amongst themselves. So they become something a little
So
bit.
do they become their own race?
Kind of, but not really, of course. It's all rubbish, isn't it?
But I guess in terms of the way in which a human being can perceive another human being, depending upon the hue of their skin tone, or colour rather, that will determine what race they belong to. So it is possible, isn't it, with the whole issue of passing, for example, that a black person could be fair enough or light enough to be considered Caucasian, even if they're not DNA-wise Caucasian, which shows, as you were saying, Katrina, the whole ridiculous nature of this classificatory system, doesn't it? It's what the eye perceives, how...
Yeah, because in real terms, an awful lot of us have DNA which emanates from people who were a different skin color to ourselves, going back into the past, but you don't know anymore. I mean, my children, if they decide to marry white people, the grandchildren are going to look almost not noticeable, probably, in amongst a group of white people. And on the other hand, if they marry somebody who is dark-skinned, the children will probably look darker. I mean, you can't always say that for sure.
Yeah.
I've met children who I never realized were theoretically black. So I just think it's just misleading. The concepts are misleading.
So do we think then that Jamaica has a race problem or a class problem or both? And I say that in reference to the woman that complained about her neighbor, her country boy neighbor who was making too much noise.
Jamaica has a slavery problem.
Some of my Jamaican friends, especially the ones that have grown up there, go back regularly, everything. He even tells me how someone would describe me if I went there compared to someone who was half a shade lighter or a shade lighter than me. I don't know, they were just telling me you're described based on the hue or just how dark to light you are. So I don't know if that's maybe just a colorism thing rather than a race. It could be it's a bit of both, but he just definitely remember telling me you'll be described as, I can't remember what the term was for someone very dark skinned compared to if you were in the middle or a quarter bit or whatever it was. That's how they classify kind of each other. Maybe, I don't know if it's formally or informally.
I just think it all boils down to slavery. For Jamaica, for me, it always comes back to slavery. It's all about slavery.
Yeah, you're right. What you're saying, Taiwo, it is. It all. That's when it became important.
But class and slavery went hand in hand, didn't they? In the same way that colorism and slavery went hand in hand. Whether you were in the big house or whether you were in the field, whether the sun beat down on you and made you darker, or whether you were under cover of the shade of the plantation house. And even the white people, the white people coming over from Ireland or Scotland as overseers and all the rest, they were not upper class white people. They were lower class white people, but they were obviously not slaves. They were better than a slave. But they were there in the field with the whip as the overseer or the taskmaster or whatever.
Have you been listening to White Mischief?
I listened to it all when it came out.
Was it not interesting? Sorry, I digress, but was it not interesting that working class people were not seen as white until after the Second World War? Only the aristocrats who were seen as white, and blue, that's apparently where the phrase blue blood comes from, because they were so white. They're so white because they didn't have to work in the fields.
That's really interesting, because I went to a Catholic school where I was one of the very, very few people who weren't Irish. So I met up with a friend of mine from those days not long ago, and I was saying to her how it's kind of interesting that we never heard people we talked about discrimination to do with black people. We talked about the IRA a lot because it was a Catholic school, and this is going back to the 70s, I'm afraid. Those issues were very important. I don't remember us ever talking about discrimination to do with Irish people. And I was talking to her about it and she was saying, well, definitely her parents experienced those sort of things. But by our generation, it wasn't really an issue any longer. And that's because of colour, isn't it? So I find it's interesting what you're saying.
But like even when I was younger, well, yeah, in general, even if I started a job or even at school, my mum might ask me, how many, black people, whatever, and I'd say how many other, black or brown people. But then she'll be, the Irish, how many Irish? Because she always just includes them with like people of color as well. So now, yeah. So even now, if I'm in a workplace, I'm automatically just also counting, well, how many Irish people are here too, because I don't know how it's just, yeah, I guess being ingrained in me from a young age, like they're just part of us. So yeah.
It is, yeah. So coming back to the essays, some of my favorite essays are the ones that he's traveling. He travels quite extensively, so Middle East, across Africa, the Caribbean, and I think the ones I enjoyed the most were where he was actually on the road writing about the places where he was at and how he was perceived. For example, he talks about being almost robbed in Nairobi. And then there's an instance in Ghana where they're stopped by the police and they obviously have to pay a bribe. But he's describing how it really reminds him of being in Jamaica.
I thought it would be something bad, but that seems very normal, so it's okay. Carry on.
Yeah, but then there's also his experiences in Ghana where he goes to Elmina, and I think Cape Coast Castles, and then Ethiopia where he goes to the churches, and then he encounters that Italian. I really enjoyed the reading about his experiences there, and then the similarities between cultures. And I wonder what you guys thought about the travel essays.
I felt that he seemed quite naive in some of his travels. The choices that he made, he seemed almost gullible. But then again,
Until he gets to Ghana, where he just ignores the traffic policeman. And when he begins, it's like he's suddenly realized how to handle the situation.
he's unfazed, isn't he?
Mm-hmm.
It also seemed to be as if to say, as a black man, his body is not supposed to occupy certain spaces. For example, as an international and seasoned traveller, he's not expected to move around freely. In the way in which maybe if his skin were white, his white skin would be his passport. And so if he's going around Ethiopia or he's going around Ghana or wherever, he kind of gets a pass most of the time because, it's a white man. But here is a black man. And so it's like he's not supposed, or he's not expected. Let's just say not expected to be in certain places.
But then that's the same experience he has in Scotland, where he was in Scotland or Northumberland, where he goes as a poet, and the person who's the host is actually quite surprised how good he is. So his essay, Dear Binavanga, I'm not writing about Africa, referencing the satirical essay written by Binavanga himself years ago about how to write about Africa. He talks about how to write about places and authentic characters. And then that kind of brings me back to what we were discussing earlier on. And are we not in the danger of censoring what writers can write about? Should we be prescribing to writers how they should write?
You see, I don't think you should. I think you've got to accept that you'll get a load of rubbish at times, but you have to promote the other voices as much as possible to counterbalance, isn't it? Because the problem for me about the white women writing isn't so much that they are not got the authentic voice that he wanted, but they might get published where somebody who is the authentic voice can't get published. So I think that, I wouldn't like to be telling people not to write stuff, but I think you've got to give enough opportunities for people who actually know what they're talking about to write.
So definitely, I do agree with you there, Katrina. There is an element of that publishers are discriminatory when it comes to publishing writers from certain places, unfortunately.
It's true, isn't it? It's more likely during the Biafran War that a correspondent from the Times, a white man being parachuted in to write an article about what's going down would be published much more than someone that was living there and experiencing firsthand, even though they may have been a university professor or a published writer. It's the gatekeepers, isn't it? It's the gatekeepers in the whole media industry.
And just coming back to something you said, Taiwo, the last essay number 14, and this is how we die. You sort of described it as trauma porn. If you could explain what they're about, and then I guess tell us why you think it's trauma porn.
I have to admit, it was the essay that I liked the least. I understood why he wrote it, and I understood that there is value to it, but it was hard reading it.
Do you want to say what they're about first?
It was a recount of various well-known people, yes, and how they had died at the hands of mainly the police, I think, authorities. So the encounter between a black body and a person wearing a particular uniform or in a position of authority, and how it doesn't go well for the black person. But it's written from the perspective of what they would have been thinking when they encountered the person that was going to kill them.
Yeah.
So it's like a first-person account. So it gave them more of a voice. It gave them more agency, but at the same time, reading it, and particularly as it's one after the other, after the other, after the other, it's quite traumatizing, or it can be triggering. And that's why I said, is this trauma porn?
And Katrina, what do you think of them?
Well, I agree with Taiwo. I thought they're a bit difficult to read. I was just going to check. I don't know which case was the first one, because that he wrote from the first person perspective, because I think I had to read maybe that one and start the next one to realize what was going on. You sort of want it to end differently because you're in the story of it. But I found it a bit heavy going, and yeah.
I understand why he wrote them and why he included them. They're relevant. It's what's happening today.
They're important. Yes.
Yeah. And also the fact that it actually shows the events from the person's perspective rather than what we read in the media. You were there. It's happening to you. And as Katrina said, you're willing them, to live. You're willing for it to turn out better.
Yes, exactly. It's just like somebody's going into a shop and buying some cigarettes, and it all starts to go horribly wrong. And you're reading it, and you know what's happening, but you still sort of think maybe he's going to change this. Maybe the ending's going to be changed.
Yeah.
It kind of reels you in to continue to read it. And I can understand why it was the last essay, but at the same time, it's kind of like you finish it and then you just see, big up, the acknowledgements.
Yeah,
it kind
true.
of leaves you with a bad taste in the mouth almost. It leaves you almost on a downer.
Yeah, but he addresses some of these essays to James Baldwin and also to Binyavanga. And I just wondered whether or not the essays that he addressed to those two writers read differently from the other essays, or if you read them differently.
What was the question again? Repeat, please.
First essays, the letters to James Baldwin.
Yeah.
And then he also has one where he's written to Binyavanga.
Yes.
So would it start like Dear James and then...
Yes.
Okay.
Well, I thought they were a bit more personal compared to the others. I felt that they were more from the heart. So personal, so intimate.
I think that's a good word. When you're using the word intimate, I think that's a good word, the way in which he talks from the heart, as it were. So with James Baldwin, he's accepting that Toni Morrison could call him Jimmy, but that he can't really call him Jimmy because he never knew him. And apart from that, he's accepting the fact that James Baldwin is like his big brother. So, he doesn't really have the right to call him Jimmy. And so he would call him, Dear Mr. Baldwin or whatever it was. But yeah, it does strike me as him writing personally to each of these individuals that have been a great influence in his life. He doesn't seem to censor himself, because I remember when he was writing to James, he was critical of some things, but at the same time recognized that even in the criticism, he may well never reach the heights that James Baldwin has reached. But he's still able to criticize because, James Baldwin was a human being. He wasn't a god. And so we all, as human beings, have feet of clay.
With regards to the criticism, I do feel that he's actually reached those heights already. I think he's a great writer, so he's being hard on himself.
Maybe it's humility.
True. So yeah, there's so much more that we can talk about. I mean, we haven't even touched the boys on the harbour. We haven't touched the old black woman who sat in the corner, which is really great. That was one of my
But do you
favorites.
think that, I just want, sorry to butt in, do you think that story, the old black woman that sat in the corner, what happened to the old black woman, plus the other story, Mr. Brown, Mrs. White, Ms. Black, do you think that apart from in Jamaica or maybe some other Caribbean islands, those stories would be very hard to have occurred? They seem to be quite unique to.
I don't think so. I think it could very equally happen on the African continent.
I think there's lots of parts of the world where those sort of things could happen.
Oh, I've lived a very sheltered life.
No, it's just where people are poor and disadvantaged, or both, or men have power and women don't, and that's not the whole of it, but all these things interact, don't they?
Yeah. So yeah, I guess I have kept you long enough. It only leaves me to ask, first of all, Annette, are you going to read the book?
I will read the book. I will definitely read the book. I've missed out. So I will.
It's worth reading, definitely.
How about you, Katrina? What would you recommend it, and what would you rate it out of 5?
I think I'll still stick to rating it 3.5, because how can I put it? I feel like it's a really important book. I would definitely recommend it. I would tell people to read it, but I don't know how to put it. It's not a book that it's a bit too heavy going, maybe. But I would still recommend it. I think there's lots in there that people ought to read.
I stick with my 4.5. I really did enjoy it, despite my criticism of the last essay, which, it wasn't a fun read, but I still feel that he was able to master the different voices of these separate individuals and their thought patterns, their interior lives. So I think he's such a talented person, but he's not just an essayist, he's a poet. His fiction is wonderful, and I mean, listening to The Warner Woman, which he read himself, is one of my favorite books, one of my favorite audio books. So yeah, I just feel he's just so gifted and talented and courageous, because there's so many ways in which in this book he wrote about himself, but not in a flattering light. He showed his frailties, he showed his weaknesses.
Yeah, his vulnerabilities all come out. Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with you, Taiwo. I'll give it a 4.5. I'm buying 3 more copies.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I'm buying 3 more copies. One for my friend who's featured in the book, and for 2 friends who write. I think it would inspire them, because their style of writing is quite similar to this, and I think the book would actually inspire them to publish what they write. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for reading the book, and thank you for listening. So join us for the next episode, where we shall be discussing the sex lives of African women. I can't wait. Bye bye.